Right now, we are just drafting the assertions and the objectives of the assertions and procedures, and hopefully we'll continue that work and get more detailed guidance out there for preparers to use. Right now, all that's out there is the PCAOB staff Q&As, which really dealt with the voluntary filing program. And they were before the SEC rules came out. They were before the detailed requirements in the Edgar filing manual that companies now have to comply with related to XBRL. There's a whole chapter of those. So really a little bit outdated and not quite specific enough to be as meaningful as they could be. So we're working on developing those a bit more. This is a little bit touchy at this point because most companies that are looking at XBRL implementations are mandated to do so. They're public companies. And so, you're really in the public company audit space, which is really the PCAOB's domain, which is why we're working with them so closely to make sure that we don't overstep our boundary. At the same time, this item isn't on their active agenda that they just revised. And I think it's a really important area that needs to be covered, and so we're trying to show leadership on behalf of the profession to deal with the expectation gap and get some meaningful guidance out there so that the profession can act in somewhat of a coordinated manner. Because we think the clients, well, in fact, the clients are already asking for certain engagements, and I think that's only going to increase as we move, like I said, as we move to full liability. There are other issues as well. I don't know if you're familiar with inline XBRL, but that's basically going to enable companies to embed their XBRL tags right into the source document, which still has assurance issues related to it, but does nothing other than to even expand that expectation gap even further. So with those issues looming on the horizon, I think that it's inevitable that we'll need to go in this direction. The other things that we're doing around mitigating the expectation gap, at least for the short term, as I said, the CAQ alert talks about clarifying in the auditor's report what the auditor did do. Also, we're working with the SEC. Eric Cohen has been leading this effort actually to consider the technical capabilities for how preparers can communicate auditor involvement within the exhibit that they submit. They do have control over that since they submit the exhibit, but at least trying to figure out the best way to do that. And then also, of course, the profession is talking about how they can better communicate auditor responsibility within engagement letters and SAS 61 communications. A third area that the Assurance Services Executive Committee is working in is the area of risk. And this, of course, was a result of the recent economic crisis, and a lot of concern that the profession needs to do a better job of understanding and looking at risk in a more systematic way. And so we've been working with Miklos and his students on a project to really first kind of understand the landscape. And so we've been doing interviews with risk leaders in the marketplace, not just from the profession, but from other organizations, investor representatives, regulatory representatives, to really get a better understanding of what the potential needs are and whether or not there might be a need for an assurance service on risk. Right now, we are also talking to representatives from the big firms to see what they're doing from a practice perspective. What we're seeing now is more a lot of consulting services around the risk, and then any assurance services related to risk aren't done by the external auditor, they're done by internal audit. But we'll keep an eye on this and make sure that there's not an evolution that we need to be addressing. And that study's really in its infancy phases. We haven't gotten as far as we hope to yet. The final work stream of the Assurance Services Executive Committee is the Future of Assurance Working Group. This is probably my favorite group, not the people, the subject matter. They're all my favorites. But the purpose of this group is that I was getting frustrated. You heard a lot of frustration from the panelists this morning that, there's so much opportunity for the profession to take a leadership role, to act in the public interest, and yet we always tend to be so bogged down in dealing with the issues of the day. And so the purpose of ASEC is really what this group is all about. It's to look to the future and say, how are things evolving? We have not been successful in telling people what we know, what everyone in this room knows, which is that things are moving in this direction and we need to get on board or be left behind. We haven't been successful in making that case by saying, here's where it's going to be in 10, 20 years. And so, Miklos, I know you don't love this approach, but we decided to try to take a baby steps approach and to kind of lay out from today things that are actually happening today, like the XBRL mandate and inline XBRL, and things that are happening related to convergence, to actually lay out sort of on a timeline the things that are going to change that we know are changing, specific events that are taking place, and what impact each of those could potentially have on assurance and how the profession might address that impact. And so the output of this group will really be some recommendations, I hope, that will be given to other groups that do have decision-making power in this area. They could go to the PCAOB, they could go to the Center for Audit Quality, they could go just to the profession as a whole. But that's really the objective, is to kind of bridge from where we are today to where we know things are headed, to help people better understand the opportunities and see it more as an opportunity rather than something that is not relevant to the profession. And so this group is really just kicking off. We're in our early phases, and hopefully by next year we'll have some preliminary recommendations ready to share. And that's pretty much everything that I have. Does anyone have any questions or for discussion? Yes?
What is the impact of IFRS on changing XBRL? Because they're studying the whole presentation of financial statements, which I guess is going to create a great turmoil over TIG.
Yes. This is a really tough issue. You know, right now, there are major efforts going on around the world either to develop or where they've already been developed to maintain taxonomies. And so right now you've got a US GAAP taxonomy, which was actually, in the grand scheme of things, quite easy to develop because US GAAP is very detailed, so it enables you to create a very robust taxonomy. IFRS, on the other hand, is principles-based, much less detailed, and so then you've got a risk for a whole lot of company-specific extensions to be created, which then becomes a problem. It kind of negates a lot of the benefit of XBRL, which is transparency and comparability to some extent, at least through transparency. And so right now, there's a lot of debate going on around the implications of convergence on the taxonomies themselves. I would envision, and this is just my personal opinion, that as we move towards convergence, you probably still need a lot of those detailed US GAAP tags. They could be incorporated into a converged taxonomy at some point, just to make sure that the taxonomy is robust and we don't have so many extensions. But it is a challenge, and that is just my idea of what will happen, but that solution hasn't been articulated yet or agreed upon. But the SEC and the IASB are working on that together. And there is a common taxonomy architecture, at least underlying it, so that there can be convergence at some point. Any other questions? Yes?
I would like to know what's the current stage of that project between XBRL and the APR consortium. Are they developing the taxonomy? How is it going?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the ABRC is a consortium that's focused on enhanced business reporting, which means reporting that complements traditional financial reporting. We have joined an international network, which is called the World Intellectual Capital Initiative. And what that is just an informal network of groups that are coming together to contribute intellectual capital. So the EBRC has contributed our framework for enhanced business reporting, and our partners in Japan and Europe are following suit and contributing their content. All of the data sets that have been contributed as content have been tagged and have been translated into XBRL taxonomies. So those are already ready. They're out on the wiki website. You can follow the link to core filing site where you can actually review the taxonomies, although right now they're transitioning us over to Yeti, so it'll probably be a little bit better from a user friendliness standpoint in a couple of weeks. The other thing that EBRC did is we developed a taxonomy for tagging of MD&A, because we think that that's probably one of the most important applications of XBRL, even though unfortunately, the SEC rules actually preclude companies from submitting tagged MD&A right now. I think they did that because there wasn't a good taxonomy out there and they didn't want 5,000 company-specific extensions. So they precluded it until they got a better taxonomy.